Hi Mark, what are we doing today then?
Well, today we want to show how the new transit kit for the transit front wheel bearing works. And this is a transit front hub, but we've prepared this one so that the camera can see what's going on.
So the disc's mounted on the back?
Yeah, normally it would be, and the reason we've taken it off is so that you can see what we're doing. But usually the disc is there. You can access the fixing bolts through the holes here, which we'll do in a minute. And our tool will go on the back of the hub to push off the whole unit, which allows you to change the disc. Then our tool can be used to actually remove the bearing from the drive flange, as well as the final bit of the job, which is the removal of the inner bearing that always stays put on the drive flange, like we've got here. This one stays put. So we've made another tool to pull that off. So you take the drive shaft or dummy shaft, as it is in this case, because this is off a front-wheel drive vehicle, rear-wheel drive vehicle. Take that out. Take these bolts off, and then you can start mounting the tool from behind. And you can do it all on the vehicle. So in fact, that's what we'll do. First thing, take the mounting screws out. Obviously on the vehicle they're never this clean. One thing to bear in mind when you've got all these bolts out, just don't throw them away. A, you're going to use them again to mount the new bearing, and B, you use them to mount the tool on the back. So when you've got these screws out, clean the threads up and clean the threads up in the hub itself.
So once you've pulled these bolts out, can you not just pull the flange off, no?
In an ideal world that would be great, but unfortunately the bearing body actually seizes into the hub, so you need a little bit of assistance. Now, in some cases people have tried bolting the wheel back on and knocking 7 bells out of it, but it's really not ideal, and it's a big lump of steel to be catching. So we've thought about that with this tool. We need to set up the force screw so that we can push this bearing out. But if we were only doing the disc, we don't want to damage the bearing. So it's critical that we use the right size top hat in the back here. And once that's in the back, bearing in mind you're doing this on the vehicle, that goes in place. Being aware that usually there's an ABS sensor there, so you need, it's a bit delicate. So make sure that top hat is nice and loose and not bound on anything. Once we've got all the bolts in place, make sure they're all nipped up nice and tight. The next job is the force screw, which is easy. As I say, just stick your finger in there, make sure that's nice and loose, and prepare to put the force screw in, but don't wind it in yet. You've got to use some grease. Millennium disulfide, the black grease you find in drive shafts and etc. It's the only stuff that is the proper stuff. And all you do is you wind this in, it winds in and eventually pushes out the bearing, the whole assembly. So if I turn this for the camera, and here you can see she's winding apart nicely. This one's coming out relatively easy compared to most, and that's it, job done. That's the first bit of the operation done. Now I would be able to get the disc off. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to remove the outer body of the bearing. It will unfortunately leave the inner bearing in place as I explained earlier. For this one we use the smaller top hat, which will go straight up the inside of the bearing and be pushing on the drive flange. Put that on top, nice and steady, and then using the 5 bolts that come in the kit, we bolt it down. Bolt them down nice and even. It's quite important that this is pulling square, so you need to be nice and even. So just wind it all down and then tighten them up nice and evenly. Okay, 17mm spanners to tighten it down. Just make sure it's all tightened down. Anything that's left loose, nip it up again. Right, we need to make absolutely certain that we've got plenty of molybdenum disulfide grease on here. We don't want this thread to go dry. It will put up with a huge amount of force, but only if it's correctly lubricated. This component here we call a impact force screw. You'll see why in a minute, but as we tighten this down to as tight as it will go, and then we hit it with a hammer. That's what it's designed for. The shock of the hammer goes straight down the middle, onto the bearing, and helps separate the bearing. Tight as it will go, and then whack it with a hammer. Tight as it will go, and then whack it with a hammer. If I was doing this out in the yard where I couldn't use it in a vise, this is the best way, but if I can get it to a vise, then we can do this. Now we can get a little bit more leverage on it, and because we've used the whacking process already, we've already jarred the bearing. And now what we should see is a gap opening up here. It'll leave the inner bearing behind, but this housing is now moving that way. It's coming apart. Be aware, it's going to fall out, so you need to be ready to catch it. There we go. What would normally happen now in a workshop is you would cut this ring of rollers off and then grind the inner bearing till it was very thin and then hit it with a chisel. Problem is, for all sorts of health and safety reasons, grinding in a workshop is really no longer acceptable. So we've developed a process, which is an engineered solution to allow us to remove that bearing using this tool. Okay, in order to remove the inner bearing, this here, the inner race, we needed to find a solution that would get a grip on it and then pull it square. We could have tried to use a common or garden bearing splitter, but there just isn't the space to get it in there, and they're not terribly successful, and they don't guarantee pulling straight. We needed a proper engineered solution for this, and here it is. So what we're going to do is, this fits on perfectly round here. As it happens, on this bearing there's a little lip here that we can grip on, but we need to have our tool engineered to fit it, which this is, and it has to go underneath that lip. Oh, there we go. Now that's underneath the lip. When you position this, before you finally tighten these fixing bolts up, but try and position either those three holes or those three holes so that they line up with the bigger holes in the drive flange. It makes fitting the bolts and fitting the nuts a lot easier. Just like that. Do the 13mm pinch bolts up. take the main body of the original tool, the small top hat of the original tool, it goes there. The bolts from the new tool and the cross tubes. You're only using 3 of the fixing holes on the tool. That's all aligned up now. Now all I have to do is put the nuts on. Make sure when you put the nuts on, you tighten them all down evenly and that you haven't got the bottom of the force screw touching, because that will guarantee that you are actually doing what the tubes say they're for, and that's attempting to crush them. They're crush tubes, they're alignment tubes. Okay, let's start pulling. Here she goes. Now I'm going to move to using a bigger, longer bar to make life easier. And as with the other bit, remember, it is going to fall out. There it is. That is now ready for assembly to your new bearing.